in terms of my humanities classes. But one of the things that I noticed early on when I began studying those matters is that many people seemed, whenever they thought of public policy, to discuss only particular policies promoted at that moment in time. And it seems to me undergirding your answer to any particular policy is a general theory of government. And it seemed to me that one of the things that had characterized the current moment is that we think about particular pressing issues, but without the benefit of an undergirding political philosophy. So if you think back 2 centuries, and unfortunately I teach an introduction to media ecology, so I'm very interested in the question of how media change over the years. In the 17th and early 18th century, and here in the colonies, most newspapers were only published monthly or twice a month. So what they called news then was actually not new by our standards, where we have 24-hour news, right? And so what happened was, if you can think of a seesaw on the playground where the children are, where whenever one side goes up, the other inevitably descends, if you think in those terms, news and journalism always was something like this: commentary on current events. But at one time, the number of events was down and the amount of commentary was high, and now the number of events is very high and the amount of intelligent commentary is very low, right? You have 24 hours in a day. Whenever you increase one thing, something else will decrease. So when you think about it, for roughly 8-9 months in the colonies, they discussed 75 plus papers that we now know as the Federalist Papers, all devoted to the question of whether we should endorse the newly proposed constitution of these 13 colonies into a common nation. They were organized by their 3 authors. The anti-Federalist Papers took up about 8 or 10 times as much press because they were less organized and more sporadic. And so if you find printed editions of the anti-Federalist Papers, they normally appear in 3 and 5 volumes. Now, what's fascinating about the pro-Federalist and the anti-Federalist position, there was no particular policy at stake. It was just, how do we conceive of government of people with different interests up and down, at that time, the East Coast, basically. Nothing further west than West Virginia at the time. So it was really just the colonies, the 13 colonies up and down the East Coast. And they spent 8 months and 78 papers, I think it was, arguing for why the Constitution should be ratified, without a particular policy being in there at all. And now we never talk political theory. We almost always talk policy. So early on, when I moved from the graduate level to the undergraduate level at Grove City in '99, I began to think about this issue of a more comprehensive understanding of government per se, instead of a merely reactionary response to every proposed solution to every proposed problem. And that's when I began to study those greater, broader biblical passages that dealt with the broader, comprehensive issue of human government. And so in our few conversations together, that's what I intend to do, to take from the Mosaic era the most comprehensive statement on human government, with a little help from 1 Samuel 8, what Jesus said about it. And by the way, don't bring your children for that. He has nothing good. He makes Lord Acton look positively rosy by comparison. And then what Paul the Apostle says in Romans 13. Most of the handouts are fairly similar to this one, where I take an extended passage of Holy Scripture and place just 1 or 2 comments on the side and possibly italicize things that I want to make sure we don't miss. But there's also plenty of space in there for Debbie Morris and others to write questions and things that she knows I can't answer. So there's plenty of deliberate free space in there. The italicized things on your handout are not the result of Microsoft Word's random error generator program. Those are all actually intentional, and I put them in there out of my own deviousness. So I want to say a few words about Genesis 9 as what I regard to be the biblical underpinning to everything else said in the Holy Scriptures about government. But I want to say something about reading Genesis itself, because it's hard for us to do. The Bible, in its 66 books, it seems to me, contains a narrative. It is the narrative of the first Adam to the last Adam. And there are a number of little interesting incidents in between. Hence 66 books and not 2. But it is essentially a narrative. And indeed, well over half of the Holy Scripture is narrative. Well over half of the Greek New Testament or English New Testament is the 5 historical books that begin it, the 4 Gospels and Acts. They constitute about 500 pages of the 900 pages of a Greek text. And then there are places like Galatians 1 and 2 that are also narrative, even within the so-called non-narrative books. And with the Old Testament, the percentage is about the same. 58 to 62% of it is also narrative. And I say this because to read and appreciate a piece of literature, we have to understand it for what it is. What makes narrative so interesting to us as humans, and therefore probably accounts for why it is universal. Some cultures have no equivalent of poetry, for instance. One of the reasons narrative is so universal, I think, is when a narrative begins, it's a little bit like a boat pushing away from the dock, and it begins a journey. And we start raising questions about where it might go. And so if it's an interesting narrative, it interests us either positively or negatively or both. That is to say, the initial narrative either creates fear, concern, dread, or some other negative expectation, or it creates positive hope, aspiration, potential fulfillment out there. And of course, if it's skillfully done, then you weave together, as Tolstoy does in Anna Karenina, Anna and the Count on the one hand, Dolly and Levin on the other, and you have one apparently promising narrative that goes the other direction, and a very unpromising narrative that becomes very promising. And skillfully, the two are woven together in a way that you just can't put it down once you're 100 to 150 pages into it. Tolstoy has you then, and you're stuck. One of the difficulties for you and me with the Bible is we rarely read it as narrative. We read it trying to look for some immediate benefit. And I don't mean benefit in the callous sense. I mean, can I resist temptation better today than I did yesterday? Can I serve my children or my spouse better today than yesterday? Can I teach my Greek class better today than yesterday? So I don't mean benefit in the most self-serving sense. I just mean real, true benefit. And because of that, I think we fail to see, as you're reading through the biblical narrative, if you could imagine reading it for the first time, what negative expectations and what positive expectations might you have had? And if you go back and read it that way, then you will notice things in the narrative that you wouldn't see otherwise. So Genesis 9 appears in the first 11 chapters, and Genesis divides itself. Now, literarily, it's got 5 parts or so, or 10. But actually, the big division is 12, because in chapter 12 you have the calling of Abram. And from 12 through 50, you have God dealing with Abram and his descendants. Prior to that, God's dealing with the human race as a whole, as he will in the last Adam. And so you have Adam for everybody, last Adam for everybody, in between Abraham for his descendants, as it were, and how do they fit into that broader narrative? But Genesis 1 through 11 is not dealing with anything peculiar to Abraham or his descendants. He hasn't been called yet. So everything that Genesis 1 through 9 says, it says about the human race created in God's image, about its original creational purpose, about its abandonment of that original creative purposes, about any possible redemption from that abandonment of God's creative purposes. It's all global. And then you move particular with the calling of Abram in 12 through 50, but Genesis 1 through 11 deals with the human race qua human. Therefore, it is not subject to those interpretive questions that we normally deal with when we're reading, quote, the Old Testament. Well, they sacrificed goats. Do we have to sacrifice goats? Right? Well, no, we say that was the Israelite theocracy, and they sacrificed goats and so forth. And in the Christian church, that doesn't, quote, apply to us, or something like that we say, because that was the Israelite theocracy. But Genesis 1 through 11 is not subject to that criterion, because Genesis 1 through 11 has nothing to do with one race among all the other races on earth. It has to do with all human races together in Adam as its progenitors. It's very, very significant stuff. And so what happens is you have the two narratives of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, the narrative of human rebellion against our created purpose in Genesis 3, and then what happens? If this were a Hardy Boy mystery, and you were me 60 years ago or 50 years ago in a hammock, you'd say, well, what will happen next? Right? After they've rebelled against God and He banishes them from the garden and puts the cherubim up there to keep them out, what will happen? Have they learned their lesson? That's the positive hope, isn't it? That was a mistake, to rebel against God's order. He justly punished us, removed us from His presence. Will we have learned? And will the next generation do better? That's our positive hope. Our negative fear is, did someone just trip on the top step of a flight of 13 stairs, and will they go down another 12 steps before they hit the next landing? Right? So you come out of Genesis 3. If you could imagine reading it the first time, you would have both a positive and a negative expectation. That's the way we read narrative. That's just the way we read it. And so we have the birth of these two delightful young men, Abel and Cain. And they're out throwing frisbee and fishing. Okay, maybe not the frisbee. Right? And they offer up sacrifices to God, one of cereal and grain and vegetables, and one of meat. And God accepts the one and doesn't accept the other. And they both say, well, fair is fair, we both did our best. No, they don't say fair is fair. Cain kills his brother. And so in terms of our expectations coming out of Genesis 3, did we learn a lesson from rebelling against God's order? And will the next generation do better? The early returns are, shall we say, not encouraging. Right? Cain kills his brother Abel. And so then we start to wonder, as we move through the genealogies that follow through chapter 4, well, is the whole created purpose now shot? That the human shall exercise dominion over the things that fly and the things that swim and the things that creep. Is the whole thing gone to chaos, right? And then in the most understated book of the Bible, in my judgment at least, towards the conclusion of Genesis 4, verses 23, 22, and so forth, it has a smaller little genealogy of Cain and Tubal-Cain and some others. This was the father of those who dwelt in tents and kept sheep, and the father of those who made the flute and the lyre, and the father of those who made instruments of bronze and iron. Agriculture, technology, and music, right? The three great human enterprises. And they are still going on. So not everyone's Cain killing his brother Abel. And even there's collaborative efforts, because they call him the father of those. And he wasn't the biological father. It was like a great trade guild. And they called him father because they learned from him how to dwell in tents and keep sheep. And the father of those who make the flute and the lyre, as though they regard him as a father from whom they learn, and so forth. And the father of those who made instruments of bronze and iron. And so now chapter 4 doesn't resolve the narrative yet, does it? The biblical narrative says it begins with murder, envious murder. And it ends with the creeping attempt at the human doing what the human was supposed to do. Agriculture and music and technology, productivity, industry, however you call the making of instruments, of bronze and iron. They're doing what they're supposed to do. And so we scratch our heads and say, what next, right? We get some genealogies in chapter 5. So the real answer to what next is the children fall asleep during Reverend Smith's sermon on Genesis 5 as he reads the long list of names. I used to always recommend, by the way, to get a seminary student who was an intern to preach those texts and have the students fall asleep while he read them. But that's cowardly. And so then we get to chapter 6, and from chapter 6, 7, and 8, and early into 9, we have the well-known narrative of the preparation for and the reality of the flood judgment. That the God who already had banished us from his presence looks upon the thoughts and intentions of the human heart and sees that they are only evil continually, and he repented that he had made man. What a remarkable statement. That God, who's all-wise and all-knowing, and yet also in some sense capable of love and an artist's manufacture of what is beautiful, and he looks at the human race, and we are not what he made us to be, and he's saddened that this potentially noble creature has descended to such ignobility. And he determines to wipe the human race off from the face of the earth, except for 8 people. Right? So we have the narrative of this flood judgment. Right? And then eventually the water recedes, and the dove appears, and they hit solid ground, and they ate, and all the animals come off the boat, 2 elephants, 2 zebras, 1,417,000 chipmunks, the gerbils, countless. And so they come over, right? And so now the question is, okay, now, if Cain killing his brother didn't prove the point, did this do it? 40 days of a flood. Do these wicked humans come to their senses and say, I don't know what happened to us, but that was just a blip on the screen. That'll never happen again. We're going to do it right this time. Right? And there is the language of creation again in Genesis 9. Twice the language, be fruitful and multiply. Twice the language of Genesis 1, 26 or 28 comes back around in Genesis 9. And so that's the setting at Genesis 9 when this new group of 8 humans comes off of this after God has wiped out every other member of the human race but that clan. And now the question is, whew, glad that's over with. Clean slate. Right? No Augustinian original sin. Right? We're coming off the boat. Everything's good. Right? I think if we were reading it for the first time, we would be optimistic and say, yeah, this probably got through to them. If banishment from the garden didn't do it, wiping out all but 8 people probably, that the point got through, and now we're going to see, Heidi, all right, and things like that. It's going to be nice. The Trapp family singers and stuff, that it's going to be good from this. And that's why Genesis 9 then shows up, and it's such a strange thing, isn't it? Because it does produce twice the language of Genesis, be fruitful and multiply. And even he blessed them, the way it does in Genesis 1:26. And God blessed them and said, be fruitful and multiply. The same thing happens in Genesis 9. But remember, the first time he says that in Genesis 1, the human is yet innocent. And now you and I are hoping as they come out that they've turned from all that, they're innocent again, God blesses them and says to be fruitful and multiply. And now we're expecting the rest of this to be nice. And so for those of you with artistic sensibilities, you're even thinking, to what musical soundtrack do we put this now? And you're thinking of the early parts of Peer Gynt, maybe. Da 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 da, right? Something nice and pleasant, right? And what we get is Sturm und Drang, right? We get some Wagnerian waltz of the Valkyrs or something going on here, right? Instead, because God blessed Noah and his sons and said, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And the next sentence, the fear and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. How many buffalo once roamed these plain states out here in this part of mid-America? How many millions of bison? And how many are out there today? What kind of a job did we do of caring for those magnificent creatures? Have you seen some of those black and white photos of the bison skulls piled up in a pile, a pyramid 40 feet high? And they didn't even eat the meat, they just skinned them and did trade with the French and the British for the hides and just slaughtered them and left the vultures to eat the flesh, right? The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth and upon every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, and all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. That was not said in the original, be fruitful and multiply, right? We still are fruitful and we still multiply. We are still humans made in God's image, and we still have our created responsibility to subdue the earth for the glory of God. But now, if Cain can kill his brother, of course he can kill 100 bison, 1,000 buffalo, right? 1,000,000 tuna. Doesn't make any difference. The point is now, the human is still the human in God's economy, and will still multiply and fill the earth, and still will exercise dominion, but this part of the narrative does not suggest he's going to do it very well, does it? Right. It's a frightening sort of a thing that it says. And I give you the green plants, I give you everything, but you shall not eat flesh with its life, that is, its blood. Okay, we're supposed to cook it first. By the way, Mrs. Gordon would probably say that when I make steak tartare, I don't cook it first, but that's just a peculiarity when no one's looking that I do from time to time. And then 5 comes up out of the blue. After reasserting that the human will exercise dominion over the natural order, and yet to its dread and fear, and for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man, from his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of man. You see, we're wondering, will there be another Cain, or did the flood eradicate that murderous impulse? Right? Maybe the flood convinces us never to do such a thing again. It's now unthinkable. It's not unthinkable because there's the provision for what to do in verse 5 if it happens, right? For your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning from every man, from a beast and from man. And I emphasize the fellow man there because actually it's ish, ahiv, and it's normally translated brother, and elsewhere was used of Cain and Abel in the narrative of genitive. They still anticipate not only from your fellow man, but from your brother, that a brother will murder another brother. And I might have wished that the text translated it that way to make it clear that that's what's going on. Ordinarily, that is what more horrible thing. Not only fellow humans, but born of the same mother and seek each other's life. And this part of Genesis 9 says, don't think the Cain and Abel thing is over yet. Anticipating Jesus, brother will rise up against brother, and nation against... If brother can rise up against brother, of course nation will rise up against nation. If brotherly, filial affection does not prevent murder, how will people who hardly know each other prevent murder? Right? It's impossible. So you have this horrible thing, and he will require a reckoning as though he anticipates that it will happen again. And so the Genesis 9 narrative at verse 5, if we're thinking now we've merged into Peer Gynt and everything from here on is going to be fine, Genesis 5 says God has already anticipated humans taking other human lives of their brother and God having to require a reckoning. And so what would happen at this point in the narrative? If you're thinking, does that mean if it happens again we're going to get another flood? That's what happened last time. There were murderous impulses. A brother killed his brother, and God stepped in as an avenger and punished us. That's where I think verse 5 would leave us. It's likely that a brother will take another brother's life, and I wonder what will happen next time. If God requires a reckoning, does that mean fire up the oven roots because here comes another flood? Right? Is that what it means? I think that's how you would read it if you're reading it the first time. And that's why 6 is the crazy, crazy verse that happens at that point, because I regard it as contrary to expectation. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, because man was made in the image of God. It does not say this, whoever sheds the blood of man, by God, who just flooded you, shall his blood be shed. God is not going to be the one who avenges wrongdoing next time. If a man sheds a man's blood, Cain kills Abel, by man, not by Yahweh, not by flood, not by 40 days of rain, by man shall his blood be shed. That introduces something entirely new into the biblical narrative, that the human made in God's image now bears the horrible responsibility of executing justice the way God executed justice in the flood. And so we anticipate not only the possibility of brother rising against brother, fellow man, Ish, right, rising against his brother again. We have not only that possibility, but now this solemn reality that if it happens, I'm not going to flood every time this happens. I'm not going to keep doing this. And you remember the Genesis covenant that comes after this. There will be seed time and harvest, summer and winter, until the conclusion of history. It's just going to go on like this. And there's not going to be another flood. So we can't say, well, we just need a flood. And the 8 good people, let's see, that's Bob and Barry, Jack Sawyer, maybe a couple others, and Debbie on a good day maybe, a handful of us, we get on the boat, right? And then the flood will wipe out all the bad guys, right? Nope. By man shall his blood be shed. Not by Yahweh, not by Mr. Raingiver. By man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. Now the interpretive question that revolves around this, and that's why I italicized the Ish in each case there, and then the Adam in our verse, Ish in 5 and Adam in 5 or 6. Note that whoever sheds the blood of man, Adam, by man, Adam, shall his blood be shed, for God made Adam man in his image. Now you see the for clause, because, for, God made man in his image. To which of the 2 previous mans is it referring? Right? In the Greek class we call this the antecedent, but in this case it's actually the noun man. It's repeated 3 times. And so when you have an explanatory clause, for God made man in his own image, how does that relate back to the previous clause when man appears twice? And so the 2 possibilities conceptually and grammatically is, if a man sheds a man's blood, since the man whose blood he shed was made in God's image, he has done a horrible thing, and therefore his blood must be shed. That's a possibility. I think most people do think it means that. The other possibility is, if a man sheds a man's blood, and since man is made in the image of the God who just wiped out all but 8 humans on the face of the earth, the man who bears his image must also punish the wicked. Right? Which I take contextually as the more plausible understanding of the text. That is to say, it isn't just that because the human is God's image and therefore it's a terrible crime to murder him, but also that the human as God's image bearer now bears the awful responsibility of executing justice. And so since the human is made in God's image, he alone can be entrusted with the exercise of public justice. And now he must prevent the wicked from taking over the world because he is made in God's image. The ostrich will not prevent the Cains from killing Abel. The zebra will not prevent the Cains from killing Abel. And I, God, will not flood you every time it happens anymore and prevent you from doing it. You are made in my image, and you now have the awful and awesome responsibility as my image to execute justice just as I have executed justice. And that's why for so many portions of the Christian tradition, Genesis 9 is regarded as the institution of the civil magistrate. Because God not merely says that to do a crime like this is worthy of death, He says that if it's done, by man shall his blood be shed. By man shall his blood be shed. It doesn't say he's worthy of death. There are biblical passages that say it's worthy of death. Paul says there are those who know these things are worthy of death and they approve them and do them. But here it says, by man shall his blood be shed. And so what happens now is, in the common grace, a moment in which we find ourselves in redemptive history, God will not simply step in and wipe out the wicked whenever we find it convenient or He finds it convenient. But rather for the gospel purposes to continue until the return of Christ, there will be seed time and harvest, summer and winter, and the world will go on just so, without divine intervention to punish the wicked. He did not prevent Hitler from killing 6 million innocent Jews without a trial. The only thing that would have prevented Hitler to do it is one good German Lutheran. And apparently in those days, one good German Lutheran could not be found. Right? And so the killer of 6 million Jews should have been executed after the first order to kill 2 of them. And man forfeited the image of God, and justice was not done. And God did not step in and drown Hitler in the bathtub one night before he killed 6 million Jews. He's not going to do that. That's not the way justice works after the flood. The flood teaches us that the human race is responsible to God and will one day at the conclusion of history stand before the bar of His judgment. But it also teaches us that between then and that future day, upon imperfect human shoulders with imperfect human wisdom, is the responsibility of executing justice. And what a wonderful verb to use. Executing justice, because at the bottom there has to be at least the threat of executing the criminal. What a terrible responsibility. So Genesis 9 early on starts with the animals are filled with fear and dread because of you. And as the chapter moves along, humans swallow deeply, and we are filled with the fear and dread of this awesome responsibility also. And you, be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. So as the human goes out and grows from the original 8 that come out of the ark, and they multiply and fill the earth again, as they were told to do in Genesis 1, one of the obligations now is the only way to prevent the Cains from killing all the Abels is by man shall their blood be shed. And of course that also entails every smaller penalty that is lower than that on the scale. But it means that human justice is the only thing now here to prevent the world from descending into chaos. That's what it is. And we will see tomorrow that many people, I agree with them, think that Romans 13 is nothing more than Paul's commentary on Genesis 9. He thinks he's saying nothing new. He's just reiterating in his own terms the nature of the governmental realities in his own day when the Romans, whom the Jews hated, are now governing them. And he says, yeah, this is God's order. We've got to do it. Otherwise, Cain kills Abel and so forth. He's just reflecting on Genesis 9 when he gets there. And this is the foundation to it. It's this awful reality that bloodthirstiness and murder has not yet disappeared from the human race. And yet God, because of His redemptive purposes, is not simply going to come in with a flood every now and then. That we cannot expect the Deus ex machina to come in and solve the problem. And so when people say, well, where is God when the Jews were murdered? And I said, well, he was there in Genesis 9 before, saying it was the responsibility of the German chancellors to make sure that justice was done. He plainly said he wasn't going to do it anymore. So that's where he was. He had given to us the responsibility of making sure the wicked did not commit wickedness, and we abdicated our responsibility. You could trace human history from Genesis 9 to the present as a pendulum, because as humans and as sinful humans, we find that we are pendulum-like as individuals, as cultures, that we are like the pendulum that tarries at the extreme, races through the middle over to the next extreme. And so we either overrule or underrule. Humans just overrule or underrule. We abdicate our responsibility and let everything go to pieces, or we become harsh, right? We have difficulty finding that spot in the middle where we say, well, we have to do something, but we don't have to do everything, right? And so temperamentally, by culture, by family, by all sorts of things, by historical circumstances, we find that on the one hand, we find people being heavy-handed in the exercise of the rule God has given to the human race. And then we find, on the other hand, people abdicating their responsibility to rule on behalf of God. It's very, very difficult to get the thing right. But the plain reality that we have here is that God instituted this. I would only add to the language of it that the shall of verse 6 is the same shall, it's the same cal imperfect that is in 8 of the 10 commands in the Decalogue. That is to say, it is grammatically the same as you shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. That's the same shall of by man shall his blood be shed. It is imperatival that we not farm this out to the giraffe or farm it out to something else. Wild hogs, feral dogs, mothers-in-law, other creatures naturally suited to the task, as it were, but rather, in fact, that by man shall his blood be shed is a divine imperative expressed in the same language that the same Moses later uses to say shall not steal, shall not commit adultery, shall honor father and mother. It's the same language in the original that we have here. It's a divine institution. So all human government that comes to us from this, including the fear and the dread. Because Cain was a man, and Abel was a man. And God is now placing in human hands the authority to punish the wicked. And you could easily raise the question, couldn't you, in reading Genesis 9, what happens if Cain comes to power? He will kill Abel's, hand over fist, as Hitler did. Just go about killing the innocent, and the best innocent, right? What a horrible, remarkable human loss that is. The Jews in our culture have always made up 3.5% of the population, give or take a very small change from the days of the colonies to the present, 3.5%. But if you look at the awards given for unusual achievement, Nobel Peace Prizes, awards in science, find your violinists, right? Keep going, right down the line. Our Jewish friends take 40 to 60% of these things, and they're 3.5% of the population. And people say, they ask me the theological question, are they still specially blessed by God? And I say, no, and they don't need it. People that are that clever, that talented, and that able don't even need any special help from God, right? The rest of us do, right? Scotch-Irish, we need it, but the Jews don't, right? And theologically, I don't think they have it. But they're certainly remarkably able people. And where would the world be today if Hitler hadn't killed 6 to 8 million of them? Right? Einstein barely got here a year and a half ahead of time. Right? So it's a remarkable thing. The frightening reality of Genesis 9 is it just says, by man shall his blood be shed, and that man could be Cain or that man could be Abel. And if you look at human history, sometimes it's more Cain-like, and sometimes it's more Abel-like, isn't it? That both are out there. It's not just nature that's read in tooth and claw. Sometimes human affairs are read in tooth and claw. But there simply is no other alternative to it. This is the divine mandate, that it is now a human responsibility by man that the wicked shall be made to conform, at least substantially, with the order of God, so that those who attempt to do what the creation mandate requires can be enabled to do it. And so now we have the responsibility, you might say, of policing ourselves. That's the human duty. Otherwise, the wicked will simply take over. And so human government was not just something that Locke thought up, or that Hume thought up, or Jefferson thought up, or Ben Franklin thought up when he wasn't chasing French women through Paris. It was something that was thought up in Genesis 9, that God recognized that in light of the reality that humans were in full revolt against his order, he only has two options. A flood every now and then just to clean things out, right? And then how could you ever evangelize massive numbers such as we see spoken of in the book of Revelation? Or we institute some imperfect form of human government to restrain the wicked, to make them, to anticipate the language of Romans 13, a terror to evil conduct, so that those who are roughly productive and participating in the Genesis 1 creation mandate can do what they're trying to do. It's remarkable if you look at it throughout human history, that especially since the curse of Genesis 3, how difficult it is to create and how easy it is to destroy. The wicked can take down the work of the righteous in a short amount of time. You can see an 8 and a 10-year-old on the beach on vacation, spending the entire morning from 8 a.m. until nearly noon when called in for lunch to build a rather elaborate sand castle. And before they go back out, just as they're leaving the table to go back and work on it some more, some kid comes along, and with 2 or 3 swift kicks, he knocks down 4 hours of work in less than 4 seconds of destructive behavior. And unfortunately, every good human thing can be the result of the same reality. That the labor to make responsible use of God's created order is polygenerational. It takes many years, and it's hard to do, and it can be destroyed extremely quickly. And so Genesis 9 warns us of what happens. If we do not restrain the wicked, they will destroy the whole created order. And for God to be redemptive and to provide a pause in his final judgment long enough for the redemptive call to be issued to the human race, it means that we have to do something to neutralize the effect of the wicked. By man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And while I do think either interpretation is plausible and possible, I do think both contextually and positionally, the man of the third clause refers to the man of the second clause. Ordinarily, the antecedent refers back to the noun or pronoun most proximate to it. And so the most proximate for God made man in his own image is by man shall his blood be shed, as the human has this awful, difficult responsibility of exercising justice. So let me pause. That's a hint of the narrative in its context, I think, and it's somewhat foundational to what the rest of the Scriptures will say, including their lament on bad government. Psalm 2, the kings of the earth rise up. The rulers take counsel against the Lord and against his anointed, and say, let us break their bands asunder, let us cast their cords away. They appear, rather than to enforce his wishes, to be rebels against it. But he who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord will have them in derision. So the psalmist is quite candid about the fact that much of human government utterly fails to do what is instituted by God to do. And in fact rises up in authority in its rebellion against God. And the very holders of power, as Hitler's Germany, rise up and use their power to inflict injustice upon the comparative innocent rather than to enforce the ways and wishes of God. So from here on, it becomes just as frightening as it is here. That's why it's so interesting to me that right after be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth in verse 1, which sounds to me so Edenic, it's immediately followed the fear of you and the dread of you. Right? We still have our duty that we were created to do. But now, other creatures, non-human and human, will fear and dread the exercise of human responsibility that was assigned to us in creation and reassigned to us in Genesis 9. It is now a fearful and dreadful thing that humans are doing such. And yet he gives it to no one else. Doesn't give it to the angels, doesn't give it to the giraffe. He gives it to the human. It's still our responsibility to see to it that it's done. So let me entertain, if I can, questions about Genesis 9 and how it's foundational, if you have them, for what we're going to see in subsequent chapters also. Doesn't mean that every nation, by the way, that has attempted to fulfill Genesis 9:6 has done it correctly. I think the United States has never done it correctly, for instance. You'll note in the Mosaic Law, for instance, that the capital crimes have a higher standard of conviction in a trial than non-capital crimes. But in American jurisprudence, we have the same standard of conviction for capital crimes and non-capital crimes. And so beyond reasonable doubt is the same standard for a challenged lesser crime as it is for a greater crime or a capital crime. So I don't think our culture in its history has ever executed capital justice systemically correctly. It has always done it wrongly. So it is right compared to other Western nations in saying that nations need to do it, but it is wrong in not also following the biblical prescription that in capital crimes, because the consequences are so grave, the standards of conviction should be graver also and more demanding than they are in other crimes. And so I don't know how many, if any, nations have ever done it rightly, but the solution to doing something wrongly, if you say, what's better to do it wrongly or not to do it at all, I don't know. That's a Sophie's choice. I don't really. If you ask me which way I plan to sin against God's will tomorrow, I'd rather not make the decision tonight. Right? On this point of the question was whether the United States has done better than other nations or cultures historically in executing justice. And so first of all, I'm incompetent to say because it's just too large a question. But it ought to have done better, let's put it that way, because we had centuries of British common law to inform our own system. And so beginning with Magna Carta, so 1044 or so, and then on, the notion of actually enshrining certain principles in law and then continuing to refine the process. And then if you look at the Bill of Rights, after the first two or three, almost at least 5 or 6 of the rest of them are actually rather picayune points of judicial process. No self-incrimination, the right to confront your accuser, the right to a speedy trial, the right to a jury of your peers. So, some of those are big. The First Amendment's protecting of speech and press and public assembly and religion and so forth. Some of us think the Second Amendment's big. But then you have a bunch of the other ones are actually really insisting on jurisprudence, justice and jurisprudence on what constitutes a proper trial. So we probably should have done better than any other nation because among Western nations we are later and we had their experiments to learn from, both where they succeeded, British common law, and where they failed to succeed. Whether the House of Lords versus House of Commons, who are the justices hearing the case and so forth, that kind of a thing. So I think on paper, probably our Constitution provides for a fairly advanced human system of government. Whether it's been exercised well or not would just be too comprehensive for a Greek professor to answer.
Like killing adulterers?
There's sort of two parts to that. The historical question of Islam that I'll pass on for a moment, maybe come back to it. But I think the Protestant confessions, in distinguishing the Old Testament law into the categories of moral, civil, and ceremonial, are very clear that both the ceremonial laws and the civil laws were peculiar to Israel as a theocracy and have expired together with the state of that people. That's the language of Westminster 19. So I don't think that it would be just now to make blasphemy a capital crime, or or Sabbath breaking a capital crime. So if you look at the 5 or 6 or 7 capital crimes in Israel, I think the bulk of the Protestant tradition has argued those were part of the Israelite theocracy, which was a picture of the final estate, of the profound separation of the wicked and the righteous. And so as such religious crimes as blasphemy and Sabbath breaking were also capital crimes. So I don't think that I'm aware of any Protestant traditions that think that that all of the capital crimes in the Israelite theocracy should be capital crimes today. But Genesis 9 appears long before the calling of Abraham, and therefore more than 600 years after that, before the calling of Moses. And so the Genesis 9 reality is a human reality, not an Israelite reality or a reality just of the Israelite theocracy. So murder, that a human taking the life of another human, is a matter that it should be a capital crime in all cultures, at all times, in all places. And then the question would be, how do we find a just and equitable way of doing it? And in terms of our earlier mentioned pendulum, one of the reasons the pendulum doesn't tarry forever is when a culture decides to get tough on crime, before long they're killing Jews. And then out of reaction to killing Jews, they get tough on nothing. And then after suffering the consequences of getting tough on nothing, they come back around. So that it's very, very hard to find a balanced culture that has both severity where severity is needed and mercy where mercy is needed. It's extremely difficult. The tendency is almost always to go from one extreme to the other.
If that makes any sense.
Since the first 11 chapters of Genesis are Moses' way of addressing God's dealing with humanity qua humanity, rather than the children of Abraham as children of Abraham, my general interpretive position, I think it's the common one, is that Genesis 1 through 11 deal with the human as human, not the human as a particular theocratic people through whom he would prepare the world for the coming Christ. And therefore its instructions are germane to the human qua human. That's why the twice replication of be fruitful and multiply in Genesis 9 harkens back to Genesis 1, indicating that Genesis 9 is a kind of a recommitting of the mandate of the creation in Genesis 1. The human is still to be fruitful and multiply and exercise dominion. But since the human is now himself flawed, his exercising dominion now creates fear and dread. And is a fearsome responsibility, because how do we assure that Cain, not Abel, gets an office or vice versa? And so if that's the way, if that was the intention of the question, yes, I certainly think that all cultures are obliged to fulfill the mandate of Genesis 9, or to strive towards its fulfillment, right? That is to say, that is the goal of humanity, to suppress the wicked and to prevent them from preventing the righteous. It's a way of preventing the 10-year-old with the Bigfoot from knocking over the sandcastle of the 8-year-old. That the duty of human government is largely negative, not positive. It is not its job so much to give tax breaks to people who are good, but to penalize those who are wicked. It's a terror to evil conduct, we will see in Romans 13.
Is that too big a category for Genesis 9?
It's too big a category for Genesis 9. It requires further reflection in subsequent political theory, where we wrestle with the question of if there is a duty to suppress the wicked, is it a common duty of all humans everywhere, or is it wiser and more just for that to be located in some office that we call the civil magistrate? And so do humans as individuals just go all around the world smoking out evil people, as it were, or is this entrusted to our government to make treaty with other governments to assure as much as we can human rights where they're available to us? I do know that within the strictures of such governments, there's a broader range of freedom ethically than we sometimes think. I still remember asking Mr. Frame at Westminster many years ago, if there were a just cause militarily, let's say a nation invades another nation without justification, and that smaller nation is defending itself, would it be right to serve as a mercenary in that nation's defense? And Mr. Frame said, sure, if it's a just cause, it's a just cause. It would still be a military operation, and you have simply volunteered your services to serve in the military of a country that's not your own because you judge their cause to be a noble and just cause, and therefore you are willing to risk life and limb to save them as you would your own fellow citizens, because they are, after all, your own fellow humans. And so the question of whether you are yourself otherwise under the jurisdiction of that government is irrelevant. The point would be war has to be, in some sense, relegated by the duties nations have to nations, and therefore it can't just be individuals out there waging it. This was the problem the Southerners, and I can say this as a native Richmonder, this is the problem the Southerners had with, at the end of the war, because you had Nathan Bedford Forrest wanting to continue to do guerrilla raiding as basically a private thing that he just wanted to do. And of course, once the southern states were dispersed, they had no governmental authority. All that could be done was people who had known him before within the CSA said, you cannot do this, it's unjust. A single man can't simply go out there and wage war against a nation. And so that was exactly the question they faced. And for the most part, Nathan Bedford Forrest decided to stop doing that sort of activity. But his activity in defense of what he judged to be his own nation was probably justified activity because it was ordered by President Davis. But once the nation that President Davis presided over did not exist anymore, then I think Bedford Forrest raids would have simply been unlawful. Yeah, it's probably on the abdication side of either overruling or underruling. It's kind of an underruling, isn't it? That it's the sort of unwillingness to exercise responsibility. And so it could very well, I think it's more complicated because as I view it, to have the same standards of conviction for a capital felony as you do for a misdemeanor is entirely unjust. The standard for a misdemeanor is the preponderance of evidence or the reasonable, beyond reasonable doubt. And if the standard for capital crime is the same standard, then the system of justice is flawed. So it could be that some people, out of that concern, some states and state courts have abdicated their responsibility to exercise capital punishment. But I'm sure that there would be very many others also out there that just say, well, who am I to judge? Which was what Pope Francis said at one point early in his popehood when they asked him about certain aspects regarding human sexuality, and he said, who am I to judge? And the Lutheran satire page said, well, you are ostensibly the head of the visible church of Jesus Christ on earth, and if you can't judge, no one can. So they kind of thought it was a little lame for Pope Francis to say, who am I to judge? So you probably have 3 or 4 or 5 layers of unbiblical thinking going on there. But the layer of biblical thinking would be, how can you possibly have the same standard of conviction for a misdemeanor as you do for a felony, as you do for a capital felony? Because you certainly don't in the Mosaic Law. There are graded standards of what kinds of evidence is necessary to convict, and especially for capital crimes. A great deal more is required to convict for a capital crime than for non-capital crimes. So you could have some people thinking very well-headedly about that. And then you have others who just refuse to accept the duty of Genesis 9:6, by man shall his blood be shed. under even the most perfect form of government, they just think it cannot be done. But as I say, it's grammatically the same as you shall honor your father and mother. And if God says you shall do it, you shall do it. And so I think implicit in the command to do a thing is also to do it justly. And I don't think our nation has done it justly, but that we have a duty to do it and to do it justly, I think we derive from Genesis 9 and verse 6. Yeah, well, you're barking up a different tree that I love, and that's my media ecology tree, that when news was published twice monthly, it affected us very differently than what's coming out constantly. The numbers still in the United States that you and I are much more likely to be mauled to death by a black bear than we are to be killed by a terrorist, and we're something like 10 times more likely to be killed by lightning than by a terrorist. Now, here in Kansas, maybe a little bit, the figures on a hurricane are a little different. But actually, we still lose 43,000 Americans, 38 to 43,000 Americans in automobile accidents annually. In our worst year ever, we lost 3,800 to terrorists. So the fact that it's reported on, we don't see hundreds of reports daily about automobile accidents killing people. So I also think as a media ecologist that Samuel Clemens was right, and this is back when papers were only published daily. Now it's 24-hour cycle. But even then he said the man who doesn't read the news is uninformed and the man who reads the news is misinformed. And I still think that's the case, that the purpose of news is not to disseminate news, it's to disseminate commercial messages, and the commercial messages are remunerated in terms of the amount of readership. And so they know what stories cultivate our interest. And so there is no view of reality more distorted than that which comes to you through commercial news. It's like a kaleidoscope in a carnival or something. It has very little bearing on reality. Most of the so-called ISIS killings, you've had civil wars in most of the Middle Eastern countries since the 1960s, when the Middle East was reportioned out after the 1940s, after World War II. So there's been a lot of killing and mutual killing there for a century now, virtually. And I don't know if the numbers are higher or lower. They're probably lower than they were before. But that's another story. That's a story of how the world that is relates or does not relate to the world that's reported to us. We actually dropped from 43,000. That was our high. We dropped from 43,000 to 38,000. We're down to 38,000 funerals due to the highways annually. And in our worst year, 2001, we lost 3,800 people between the Pentagon and the Trade Center towers to terrorism. Our all-time worst year, by 100 times our worst year, was still chicken feet compared to what happens every year on the highways. 1/10 of what happens on the highways. So as I was telling Jeff earlier, I'm not likely to be killed by a terrorist. I'll be killed walking across a parking lot by a woman driving an SUV and talking on her smartphone and driving diagonally through a parking lot. That's what will kill me. And I hope they'll put it on my tombstone. Right? Right. That's the graver fear.
There is intent. So.
Yeah, I think our moral horror of the one is justifiable. Our personal fear is different than moral horror. Moral horror can be raised by a good movie or a good novel, in fact. Sophie's Choice raises questions that cultivate moral horror in us and so forth. But we don't fear that tomorrow we're going to have to choose which of our children will live or not, right? And so the moral horror we feel at humans who deliberately take human life is of course different than the moral horror we feel by so-called accidental death. But the people standing at the grave and saying goodbye to their loved ones feel the grief just as deeply. No one cares. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think you'd feel more complicated. It would add an emotion to it because now it would add the emotion of anger and retribution, I suppose, and this sort of a thing. But the grief would not be any more severe or less severe. When we love people and they're gone, we miss them. And so I think that funerals are still pretty bad things in that sense, in the sense of the weight that they leave us with. But so if we feel the moral horror of people deliberately taking life, we ought to feel moral horror over it. But we shouldn't live as though it makes any difference, because it doesn't make any difference. You're 10 or 12 times more likely to be struck by lightning than to be killed by a terrorist. And in western Pennsylvania, even more likely to be killed by a black bear. And I have so little concern about that 2 nights ago, I was in the woods alone. I go out once a week and hang my hammock and sleep in the woods with the black bears. And they're looking for bigger food than me. They said, that's a Snickers bar, we don't need it. You mean the visions in Revelation that he will slay his enemies with the sword of his mouth and this sort of a thing?
Sure, or even in 1 Corinthians written.
Yeah, I guess provisionally, I haven't thought about it. Provisionally, I would say no, because I think the Genesis 9 mandate is designed to preserve an orderly order so that the gospel call can go out and the purposes of God in creation can continue. Whereas the slaying of the wicked by Christ at his glorious return, I think, is not for the purpose of extending the common grace order for more evangelism to be done. I think that is terminal and final judgment. So I think that the Genesis 9 judgment is designed to be penultimate, not final, in order for the common grace purposes of creation to continue, where when Christ returns in fiery judgment, it actually is ultimate and final judgment. So probably I would, without studying it, lean towards the other way of looking at it, that's final judgment, this is pre-final judgment. That's ultimate, and this is penultimate judgment, I think is what's going on.
Yeah, this is 9:6, or would you see a different relationship?
No, I think that most people take it in the way you just mentioned it, that what happens is, in Genesis 4, we see that God obviously notices the wrong and wishes to establish a world in which there is proper retribution for the wrongdoing, but he has not yet unfolded what he unfolds in Genesis 9, which is that the human will actually have to bear agency in that process. And in between, you have the divine flood. All right, so between Genesis 4 and Genesis 9, you have the divine flood judgment, indicating, of course, that God has a concern for what is just, but then also the curious reality in Genesis 9 that, nope, I'm not going to flood the wicked every time anymore. The human will bear the responsibility for keeping the wicked in control. So I think that reading of it that you suggested is the right one, that we're just getting the tip of the iceberg in 4, that God has a concern about wickedness when it's done, and for those to whom it's done. But it's not until Genesis 9 that we know that he will appoint the human as the agent who's responsible to exercise that vengeance. It comes later. That's why I say the Bible's a narrative that way. It continues to move along in this additive way. And if we were candid with ourselves, we would say at each point, we're a little perplexed because we're not exactly sure what to expect next, positively or negatively. And my experience has been it surprises me more often than it doesn't surprise me. Which is fine. That just means that maybe it's a corrective to me, right? But I quite often find how very surprised I am as that narrative moves along the way it unfolds. And I find myself saying, I wouldn't have done it that way, to which all of my family members say yes, and that's why we're glad you're not God. Right? Or words to that effect, that he has a better way of planning the whole thing out.
Not sure if I can be a government.
Yeah, I think that in this aspect of government as being a terror to wicked conduct, to use Romans 13 language, I think from the fall until the return of Christ, it is always necessary. And so the manner in which that sin will express itself will probably change from culture to culture, but the sin will still be there.
You don't see it just person worse. It's just
No, I sort of see it as the same. When they asked Jesus, and what will be the signs of the Son of Man, when he turns, he says, there'll be wars and rumors of wars. Nation will rise up against nation, brother against brother. He goes back to Genesis 4. The same old chaos we've had. Nothing more, nothing less. So I think he says that, that won't change. until the new heavens and the new earth, we've got the old heavens and the old earth. And the old heavens and the old earth are not gradually becoming the new heavens and the new earth. So it's still, we're looking forward to it. But no, human wickedness will continue until then. Yeah, I think that there's a number of things expressed in the Old Testament as though they were perpetual or eternal, that we later find out from subsequent biblical revelation are in fact not eternal. This is a covenant forever, basarka, in your flesh, it says to Abraham in Genesis 17. But we read Galatians, and plainly that covenant of circumcision is ended. And Paul regards it as a violation of the new covenant reality to require circumcision as a religious rite. So I think what happens is, for its purpose in Genesis 9, we are not told whether there is what you and I would now call the final judgment, acknowledged by the Apostle and Nicene Creed and by the New Testament authors. I'm not sure whether they envision such a thing happening then or not. For their purposes, it will be seed time and harvest, summer and winter, in perpetuity. And they don't know if that in perpetuity will be eternal, or if that in perpetuity will one day have another chapter in the narrative, right, in which will change it. I think it's really much later in the New Testament writings that we discover that there will be a final judgment. There will be another judgment, but it's never called merely a final or another judgment. It's the final judgment. So the next one will be an ultimate judgment as opposed to a penultimate judgment. But I'm not sure from the Old Testament record we would have known exactly about that, and surely not from the record of Genesis 9. God gives people what they need to do their duty before Him in their generation. And for many, many centuries, the duty of Genesis 9 would be there. Whether God might come in with something analogous to the flood later, Peter discusses in his letters that there will be, and that the God who destroyed the world once before will destroy it a second time. And he even expressly mentions the flood. And so we now know that through the apostolic writings. I don't know how much Jewish intertestamental speculation might have considered that or not. I think as their own Jewish situation got bleaker and bleaker up to and including the exile and even the kind of wimpy return, you might think that Israel's eschatology became profounder through the years, that her sense that this world can't be righted unless there is an act of God that comes in that fundamentally changes it all. You might see, I think, hints of that in the latter prophets, of an utter reversal of the present state. But you didn't see it yet in Genesis 9. Genesis 9 does not yet envision that kind of a reversal, a total overturning of the present order, so that the kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our God and of His Christ, and He shall reign forever and ever. That's wonderful New Testament language, but it wasn't there yet for them. For them it was this long haul of preventing the Cains from killing the Abels. And so the Abels had to be able to organize and put themselves together in some order to facilitate this. Now, this was Augustine's view, by the way, and so all Augustinians on political theory regard human government to be what we would now call a necessary evil. It is designed because it is necessary in our present situation. Evil because the very people who arbitrate it are themselves flawed and will inevitably administer some degree of maljustice and injustice into it. And yet the alternative, turning everything loose to Cain, is worse. So Aquinas' view was more benign after Augustine. Aquinas' view was that government grows out of our human nature, our social nature, to work cooperatively. But I see nothing cooperatively about killing each other. So we could have worked cooperatively without Genesis 9 in trade associations and trade unions and guilds and those kinds of things. But this says, by man shall his blood be shed. And I don't think that grows out of our nature as social beings, because had we never sinned, we would have been perfectly social beings without any need to kill each other. So I think Aquinas' view is not as well thought through as Augustine's view. But those are your two big thinkers in the West on this point. All Western political theory tends to be more Augustine or more Thomistic. And where it's Thomistic, it sees government more as a neutral thing. And where it's more Augustinian, it sees it as a necessary evil, a negative thing, fear and dread of you. God institutes it, but still is candid about the fear and the dread. The human is still going to rule over the creatures and over other creatures. And it will cause fear, and it will cause dread, and it will cause anxiety and all sorts of other things. So I think any sort of, quote, negative view of government that expects very little from it and probably wishes it did less rather than more tends to be Augustinian, and views which have a more neutral view of government as the only organization big enough to get the job done, as it were, probably reflects a more Thomistic, optimistic view of government.
This may be pushing back a little bit on the point.
Yeah, I think it changed in the last 20 years or so, didn't it? When the Supreme Court outlawed all capital punishment to all 50 states in the 70s, then I think part of the reason they did that, and part of the reason many people thought it was a tolerable decision, was because we didn't have the kind of additional standards the Mosaic Law had. Now, there were some people who were just way left, I suppose, but even among Christian people, there was, I think, at that point, some recognition that to have the same standard of conviction for all crimes was unjust. So that when it was reinstituted state by state, when it was determined that the states could make this decision, I don't know if it's every state, but I do know that many states, if not most of them, did require a separate sentencing procedure precisely because they had perceived the injustice in the older way of doing it. And so we do have a form of government that permits for amendment and alteration and change. And in this case, I think there were many people who said part of the argument against capital punishment was due to the injustice of the way it was done. And so for those who felt it ought to be done, they had to be willing to co-sponsor legislation to say we need to have another process in the case of those trials. It'd be very interesting to count. I don't know. I'm assuming it's well more than the majority of states now have a separate sentencing.
Yeah, in fact, separate probably awfully.
Yeah. And it shows a willingness to adjust to the fact that prior to that, we really did not require such an additional requirement. But the Mosaic Law plainly does. There are additional requirements for conviction in the case of capital crimes that are not required in the case of non-capital crimes. Well, I think Reverend Smith is going to call time on us for the moment, isn't he? And
1 Samuel 8, or is that tomorrow?
I think that 1 Samuel 8 will make a good deal of sense out of what Jesus says. And so I think that it would be well to wrestle with 1 Samuel 8 on the front end of Jesus, because then what he says doesn't sound as kooky as it would otherwise say.